Alright, so we are now doing 8.3, factoring trinomials. So let's look at our first example. It's x squared minus 11x plus 24. So the first thing is you have to divide by the greatest common factor. So we have the square term by itself, but there is no term here, so we don't have to divide anything by the greatest common factor, so we could skip that step. The second step is to square your first term. So I have to square this guy right here. So I'm going to just write out my brackets. And I'm going to square my first term, which is x squared. So if I square root that, remember squaring anything with an exponent, all you have to do is just divide it by 2. So x2 divided by 2 is just going to leave me with x. And then after that, you have to write down all the factors of your last digit. This 24 is my last digit, so I'm going to list all the possible factors of that. So we have 1 times 24 is 24, 2 times 12 is 24, 3 times 8 is 24, and 4 times 6 is 24. So these guys here are my factors. Then you look at each pair here and ask yourself, if I were to add and subtract any of these pairs, which one will give me an 11? So right away I'm going to see, oh look here, 3 and 8. If I add those will give me an 11. So what you have to do is just write 3 here and 8. Okay, and then you look up here and you see that it has to be a negative 11. So how do I make this become negative 11? How do I make my 3 and my 8 give me negative 11 if I were to add them? Well, if this 3 was negative and this 8 was negative, when I add these two, it will give me negative 11. And then when I times negative 3 and negative 8, it will give me a positive 24. So this here is the answer. So here I have x squared plus x minus 42. So I don't have to divide this equation by the GCF because I have my first term here is factorable, so I'm okay. Then I have to factor my first term. So again, I'm just going to draw out my brackets here. And then factor my first term, x squared, so I'm just going to have an x here and an x here. And then I'm going to look at my last term and list the possible factors for that. So I have 1 times 42, 2 times 21, 3 times 14, and 6 times 7. Then I'm going to look at my pairs here, and I'm going to think which one, if I were to add or subtract, it will give me a 1. Because remember, even though we don't see it here, there's technically a 1 right there. So I'm going to see which one will give me a 1. Well, my 6 and 7, if I subtract them, I'm going to get a 1. So I'm going to write here 6. And I'm going to write here 7. Now, looking back at the question, I need a plus 1 from this. So how do I make it that when I subtract these two, I'm going to get a plus 1? Well, if I add 7 minus 6, positive 7 minus 6 will give me a plus 1. And then when I multiply negative 6 and positive 7, I'm going to get a negative 42. So this is the answer. Alright, so here I have 5x squared plus 10x negative 75. So here I could divide out a 5 from each term. So I'm going to divide this by 5, this by 5, this by 5. The reason why I'm doing that is I want my first term here to be by itself. Okay, so I divide each one by 5. So I'm going to have my 5 outside a bracket. I'm going to work each monomial by itself. So 5x squared divided by 5, that's going to cross out the 5, and I'm just going to have here an x squared plus 10 divided by 5 is 2, then keep my x, minus 75 divided by 5 is 15. And now I have a trinomial here. So then my second step is to factor my first term. So I'm going to have my 5 outside again. I'm going to open up two brackets. And I'm going to factor my first term. So my first term is x squared, so that's just going to be an x. And then I'm going to look at my last term, which is negative 15. So I'm going to write out the factors of 15. I have 1 times 15 and 3 times 15. So which one of these, if I were to add or subtracting, will give me a 2, my middle term? Well, this guy right here, the 3 and the 5. So I'm going to write here 3 and 5. Okay, now going back to my original question, I need a plus 2 from this. So how do I subtract this so I could get a plus 2? If I were to have a positive 5 and a negative 3, it'll give me a positive 2 because 5 subtract by 3 is 2. And if I multiply negative 3 and plus 5, I'm going to get negative 15. So this is the correct answer. Alright, so here I have 7x squared plus 28x plus 21. So I could see here that I could factor out this 7, or I could divide each term by 7. So now I'm going to have a 7 outside the brackets, and then work each monomial by itself. 7 divided by 7, that's going to give me 1, so I'm just going to be left with this x squared. Add by 28 divided by 7, that's 4. And then 21 divided by 7, that's 3. Alright, so then now my second step is to factor my first term here. So I'm going to factor that. I'm going to have an x here and an x here. And then I look at my last term, which is 3, and I'm going to think of what are my factors of 3. Well, there's just 1 times 3, so I have no choice but to use this 1 and 3. So I'm going to have a 1 here and a 3 here. Now I'm going to look at my second term and see I have to make a plus 4 from this. So how do I get a plus 4 from 1 and 3? Well, if I add those two, I'll get a plus 4. And then when I times the 1 and 3, I'm going to get my 3. So this here is the correct answer. So here I have 3px2 minus 18px minus 81p. So right away I could see I could take out a p from every single term here. So I'm going to divide each one by p. And then at second look, I could see here that 3, 18, and 81 are all divisible by 3. So I could actually divide each term by 3 as well. Alright, so I'm going to have my 3p outside my brackets. And then I'm going to have 3 divided by 3, that cancels out. P divided by p, that cancels out the p. So I'm just left with an x squared minus 18 divided by 3, that's 6. P divided by p, that crosses out. So I'm just again left with an x minus 81 divided by 3, that's 27. And then p divided by p, that's gone. Alright, so now I could factor my first term. So I'm going to have 3p outside. I'm going to make 2 brackets. Factor my first term, my x squared. So I'm going to have an x here and an x here. Then I'm going to look at my last term, my 27. I'm going to list the factors of 27. That's 1 times 27 and 3 times 9. And then I'm going to ask myself, which pair here, if I add or subtract them, will give me a 6? So I could see here that 3 and 9 would give me a 6. So I'm just going to write 3 and 9 here. So I want a negative 6 from this. So with my 3 and 9, how can I get a negative 6? Well, if I have a negative 9 and add by 3, I'll get a negative 6. If I have positive 3 times by negative 9, I'm going to get a negative 27. And that's my answer.